In the fourth age of Markath, an evil festered in the west. The witch queen Mephala cast a jealous eye on the empire of Athea. She struck without warning, and one by one the outer kingdoms fell. Though the blood of the Athenians was strong, it could not stand against the dark magic of the witch queen and her armies. Defeat seemed all but certain. But a lone warrior maiden beseeched the gods and offered them her soul for the power to defeat Mephala. A bargain was struck, and she was given the keys to Oblivion, powerful relics that she used to imprison the Witch Queen within the void. The fetid throne sat empty, and the armies of darkness soon crumbled. The keys were to be taken to the ancient island fortress of Nataka, but were lost when a great storm beset the Imperial fleet. In time, the keys were forgotten, and the kingdom was at peace. But that which is made cannot be unmade, and that which is lost will one day emerge from the darkness.
Ryan Thomas at the East West here, and welcome to the official walkthrough for Hollywood Fantasy Brass, which is the next installment in our groundbreaking Hollywood Fantasy Orchestra series. And the ethos that's at the center of Hollywood Fantasy Orchestra is to capture the most iconic sounds and textures of modern fantasy, while also bringing something new and fresh to the genre. So our goal is to provide this tool set that allows you to capture the essence of modern fantasy in your music, while also opening up entirely new creative possibilities. So some of the inspiration for Hollywood Fantasy Brass came from the soundtracks to Lord of the Rings, of course, World of Warcraft, Skyrim, and many more. And the timbre of the brass instruments that were sampled for this library range from dark and ominous to just massively powerful. So in this video, we're going to take a look at each instrument individually, and then we're going to show you how they were used contextually in the soundtrack that you heard at the beginning of this video. So let's go ahead and get started. But before we cover each individual instrument, let's just talk about the library as a whole and what makes it unique. So you've got the four main instrument groups in this left-hand column, and then you've got the individual articulations in the right-hand columns. And all of the legatos in this library are, of course, true legatos. And just like all the other Hollywood series of instruments, you have the moods, which are going to alter various parameters like mic mixes and dynamic response curves. So here is what the Wagner tubas sound like in the classic mood. Here's what they sound like in the epic mood. And then in the soft mood. So one of the things that makes Hollywood Fantasy Brass unique is that all of these instruments are recorded in small ensembles. So you get kind of the intimacy of a solo instrument, but the presence of an ensemble. And these just really fit beautifully into pretty much any mix. So let's go ahead and start checking out the individual instruments. And we'll start with the alpenhorn, and these are just incredibly unique. There's really no amount of processing or programming that you can do with another brass instrument to even approach the dark, ominous sound of these alpenhorns. So this articulation contains both the sustains and the drones. Now, while these can, of course, sound absolutely massive, they can also sound breathtakingly intimate. So let's check out the sustained past articulation, which is basically a recorded crescendo into a decrescendo. And we're going to change the mood to soft and just play this with some tremolo strings. And I just love when a texture is so compelling that you can write entire sections of a soundtrack with such simple writing and let the sound itself do most of the work. Now, there are some really beautiful shorts as well, and let's try these in the epic mood. Now, the flugelhorns were such a cool surprise to me. I know they've been used in some fantasy productions in the past, but I did not expect to see them in this library. And these have the warmth of a French horn in the lower dynamic, but they can stretch the range considerably higher without sounding pinched. And I found that these make a really ideal substitution for trumpets when you have them playing triads in a support role. The shorts sound incredible as well. These are the staccatos. These are the marcatos. And the legato just absolutely blows me away. It's going to do great for those soaring, sonorous melody lines. Next are the Wagner tubas. And this is just an absolute powerhouse of an instrument. Think of a cross between a French horn and a trombone, and you've approximated the sound of the Wagner tuba. So these have been used very extensively in modern fantasy soundtracks like Lord of the Rings and Elder Scrolls V, so they definitely have a very iconic sound. And these can sound very intimate at the lower dynamics. But then these can also sound massively powerful at the higher dynamics. So let's try this in the epic mood. The shorts are also really punchy as well, and you get 3 different lengths of them, which just gives you a lot of flexibility. So these are the staccato shorts. These are the regular staccatos. These are the marcatos. And the legato for these was exceptionally well done, very natural sounding, and it's really ideal when you need a powerful brass melody that can cut through a mix like a hot knife through butter. And finally, we have the low brass, which consists of a tuba, 2 sambassos, and 3 bass trombones, which just made for a really super rich combination of instruments. And these are going to be really ideal for those low, dark brass stabs, or providing a really rich chordal structure for the rest of the orchestra. And these do get a little bit of brassiness at the higher end of their dynamic range, but they have more of a stately, majestic quality to them, rather than the edgy, brassier vibe of the Wagner tubas at the higher dynamics. So I'm going to play these at the softest and then the highest dynamics so that you can get a feel for the dynamic range. Now, the shorts are just beautifully dark and have such depth to them. Let's start with the staccatos, and we're going to try these next few articulations in the epic mood. These are the marcatos. And then you have these really cool effects like the crescendo growls, the short crescendos. These are the falls. And the cluster drop, which would make a really cool horror effect. And then you have these expressive sustains, which have a bit of a natural swell to them. And I just absolutely love the emotional range of these instruments. So those are all of the instruments and most of the articulations in the library. And again, you just have this massive emotional range, and it's iconic modern fantasy with some twists. So we're going to go ahead and see how these can be used in context in the soundtrack you heard at the beginning of this video. So we're going to play that clip again, but this time mute the voiceover and sound design so that you can hear the music by itself, and then we'll break everything down. So here it is. All right, so let's go ahead and just dig right into this. So we'll start off at the top, and we're going to start with the East-West logo sequence. And I kind of wanted this section to have something of its own flavor, so it's a little bit lighter, a little bit more mysterious fantasy than the rest of the piece. So let's go ahead and see what's going on in the strings first. And you'll notice that the writing here is not super complicated. That's kind of going to be the theme of this piece. Like I mentioned earlier in the walkthrough, when you have such amazing textures and sounds to work with, I think the writing can kind of sit back just a little bit and let those textures do a lot of the work in keeping things sonically interesting and compelling. So you just have this little line in the violins. They're basically outlining the chord here, and the celli come in with this little moving line. And then you have the celli and the basses from this low strings patch coming in to kind of ground things around measure 5. So here are the strings by themselves. All right, now let's go ahead and add the brass. And this section features the flugelhorns, which just really, really worked well here. So they're just playing this simple line here, and I have the legato articulation triggered. So let's hear how these flugelhorns just add so much to this section. And then the rest of this section is pretty much just some light percussion and this little woodwind duet that's going on in the English horn and clarinet. So here is everything together. So nothing too complicated. Let's go ahead and move on to the next section. And here is where we're introducing the villain of the story. So I just wanted something dark and mysterious. And in the high string, you just have these trills. And then, of course, you have these really beautiful tremolo lutes. This is one of my absolute favorite patches in Hollywood Fantasy strings. And so these strings, along with the lutes, sound like this by themselves. And then we're bringing in the low brass, actually on melody here. So the low brass is being featured on melody, which you don't see too often, but here it just absolutely made sense. And then you have the flugelhorns joining them in the second half of that phrase. So here is pretty much everything together. I'm just going to unsolo everything. And that low percussion roll going into that next section is actually from Hollywood Fantasy Percussion, which is one of the upcoming libraries in this series. And this next part is the battle sequence. So we needed something with a bit of energy, with some rhythmic drive to it. So this section is actually largely being driven by these low string shorts from Hollywood Fantasy Strings, which just sound absolutely incredible in this context. I'm going to go ahead and solo those so that you can hear them by themselves. They just have so much weight to them. And then you have this percussion from Hollywood Fantasy Percussion as well. So those are the rhythmic elements that are providing the drive for this section. And the brass is, of course, doing a lot of work here. So you have this call and response going between the alpenhorns, and those are going to be answered by the Wagner tubas with the sustained past articulation, which is that recorded crescendo into a decrescendo. And then at the end of this phrase, you have this ascending line in the Wagner tubas as well. So let's go ahead and solo the brass and hear it by itself. Okay, now let's go ahead and add the rest of the strings. And you just have this line in the high strings that's actually playing with the alpenhorns. Very simple line with a little bit of tremolo strings here. So let's hear everything together. And this next section represents a turn in the story. You've got the protagonist trying to work out a deal with the gods to help her defeat the Witch Queen. So I wanted the music to just represent some uncertainty here. So you have this mildly unsettling melody going on in the high strings, and the violas here are just holding out the chord. And then you have this really fun ascending line in the cello and the basses. This patch was recorded in octaves, so you get that really nice, rich movement there. So let's hear the strings by themselves. And in the second half of that phrase, the flugelhorn then takes melody and the low brass is holding out the chord. So let's see what's going on in the brass. And here you've got the flugelhorns playing that chord in this nice open voicing. And then they switch to legato, and then the low brass is supporting that chord. So here's the brass by itself. Now, besides that, you just have some vocal content from some upcoming Hollywood Fantasy Orchestra libraries. So let's go ahead and just hear everything together. Then we start to build in this next section because the Witch Queen and her armies have been defeated. So we have this sort of positive turn. And the low brass and Wagner tubas are going to be supporting the chord here. And then at measure 27, you just have this soaring counter melody come in the flugelhorns, counter melody to the melody that's going on in the high strings that you're about to hear. So here's the brass by itself. And I did double that counter melody with one of the instruments from one of our upcoming Hollywood Fantasy Orchestra libraries, and that sounds like this. So now let's hear this in context with the strings. And then with everything together, so we've got some additional vocals as well, and just a little bit of percussion and some harp. So the story in this next section is the kingdom is now at peace. Even though the keys have been lost, they've kind of been forgotten about. And so the music needed to take a bit more of a positive and warm character here. So we have these sustains in the low brass and the Wagner tubas. that are just playing this nice major chord progression. So here's what the brass sounds like by itself. Then in the strings, you have this melody that's being played by the Hardanger fiddles and the viola da gambas, and those are also being joined by the woodwinds. And you have this moving line in the cello as well. So let's go ahead and hear the brass and the strings together. All right, and then we just have some transitional elements in the percussion and a little bit of harp to round everything out. So here is everything together. Now, in this next phrase, things are taking an ominous turn once again because the keys have washed back up on the shore. And so in the brass, we have this drone in the alpenhorn that is going to be kind of creating this textural bed for everything else. And this is going to be one of those textures that you feel more than you hear when it's in the context of a mix. And then you have this chord that's just building in the rest of the brass. So here's the brass. And now let's go ahead and add the strings. And you're going to hear some trills similar to what there were at the beginning of this piece. But you also have the high strings on a tremolo articulation playing one of the lines in the flugelhorns. And then the low strings come in at 37 to kind of ground things. So here are the strings together with the brass. And then we just have a few other percussion elements and vocals to add. So here is everything together. Now for this last phrase, which is the Hollywood Fantasy Orchestra title reveal, I wanted the brass to just really let loose here. So you've got the Wagner tubas playing pretty much at the top of their dynamic range. You've got the low brass playing these bass notes. And then you have the flugelhorns coming in at measure 42 with this cool tag. So let's go ahead and hear the brass together. And you can hear it in the flugelhorns where key switching between some sustains and some shorts there. And then in the strings, you just have these very simple parts. This is a tremolo in the high strings, and then you have the low strings doubling the low brass. So let's solo the strings and hear what they sound like by themselves. Those low strings just have so much weight and power to them. So now let's go ahead and just hear everything together, because really the only other parts here is some percussion and then just some light vocals. So here is everything together. And that is pretty much it. Like I said earlier in the video, when you have such compelling sounds and textures to work with, the writing can be very simple, but still be very effective. So Hollywood Fantasy Brass is for sale right now as a standalone product, but it's also included in Composer Cloud Plus. So if you're a subscriber, it's already been added to your account. And if you liked this video, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future content. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.